Welcome to The Witch's Tales, where you will be immersed in stories of mystery, magic, and drama. Prepare yourself to face unexplained mysteries, bizarre phenomena, and strange adventures that will keep you glued to your eyes. With a captivating voice, we will take you into the world of thrilling stories, where truth and legend collide, making you wonder if everything is really just fiction. A watch that waits, unraveling the curse that follows through the rain. The job posting seemed straightforward enough. Night security guard, decent pay, minimal qualifications required. But there was one thing they didn't mention. Why had the position been vacant for 8 months? Or why had the previous guard left without so much as a word of explanation? When I asked my supervisor about it, a nervous guy with twitchy hands, he just shrugged and muttered something about people not being cut out for the quiet work. The factory stretched across 3 acres of cracked concrete and rusted metal, its tall smokestacks pointing toward the sky like accusing fingers. Built back in 1952, the factory had churned out textiles for almost 4 decades before economic pressures led to its closure. Now it stood there like a monument to decay. Broken windows stared out like dead eyes at the surrounding wasteland. My first night on the job felt pretty normal. The security office was nestled right in the center of the main building, surrounded by a maze of dormant machinery and empty production floors. 12 monitors lined the walls, each one showing a feed from the cameras scattered throughout the facility. Their blue-white glow was the only reliable light in the cramped room. My supervisor walked me through the basics: hourly patrols, logging incidents, emergency protocols. He left with what seemed like visible relief, and I settled into the worn leather chair to begin my shift. Most of the camera feeds showed empty hallways and machines covered in dust sheets. But the feeds from the upper floors, those were different. They revealed huge open spaces where fabric once moved through industrial looms. The cameras were equipped with decent night vision, casting everything in ghostly green and white. It made even familiar objects look alien, almost threatening. It wasn't until the 3rd night that I noticed something odd. Around 2 a.m., while scanning the camera feeds, I spotted some movement on camera 7. It monitored the northeast corner of the 2nd floor. At first, it was just a brief blur near the old cutting tables, a piece of debris shifting, maybe a rat, disturbed by air currents. I made a note in the log and went about my rounds. But the next night, the movement returned. And the night after that. Each time it appeared in a different spot, always on the edge of the camera's view, always too quick to make out clearly. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe small animals were moving things around. Maybe it was the camera getting old and glitchy. But something about these glimpses felt deliberate, like whatever was moving knew how to stay just out of sight, always avoiding the cameras. By my 2nd week, it wasn't just the cameras. I started feeling something more. My heart would race while I stared at the monitors, though nothing on the screen seemed to trigger it. Cold sweat would bead on my forehead, despite the stale warmth in the room. My hands began to shake constantly, making it harder to write reports. I told myself it was just the stress of the job, the caffeine, the night shifts. But the symptoms didn't go away. Then, on my 10th night, something happened that made my blood run cold. Camera 12, positioned in the main production hall, captured something I'll never forget. For about 3 seconds, a humanoid figure stood perfectly still in the middle of the frame. It looked like a person about the right proportions, But where a face should have been, there was nothing. Just a smooth, pale surface reflecting the infrared light from the camera. I stared at the monitor, hardly blinking. But when I looked away and then back again, the figure was gone. I rewound the footage, watching those 3 seconds over and over. The figure hadn't walked in or out of frame. It had just appeared and then disappeared like smoke. My hands were shaking so badly, I could barely control the video playback. The logical thing to do would have been to investigate, but I didn't move. Every part of me screamed to stay put. So I spent the rest of the night glued to the monitors, my heart hammering in my chest. The figure didn't return, but I could feel its presence. It was like a weight pressing on my mind, suggesting that I wasn't alone in the factory anymore. Sleep, when it finally came, was fitful. I dreamed of walking through the factory's dark halls while pale, featureless faces watched from the shadows. In these dreams, the faces multiplied an endless audience, with hollow, non-existent eyes observing my every move. My supervisor noticed the change in me during our weekly meeting. When he asked if everything was going fine, I hesitated. Something about the way he looked at me made me think he knew I was lying. But he didn't press the issue. Instead, he reminded me that the job required discretion and reliability, emphasizing those words a little too forcefully. Things got worse from there. The faceless figures started appearing more frequently. They'd show up in multiple cameras at once, standing motionless in different parts of the facility, like sentinels keeping watch. They never seemed interested in the building's contents or the security systems. No, their focus was on me. When I flipped through the camera feeds, I'd sometimes find one of them staring directly into the lens. Their blank faces gave me the eerie feeling that they weren't just watching, they were looking through the monitors straight into me. As I stood there, I could feel my chest tightening. The figure before me was somehow breathing. Its chest moved in sync with my own, as if it was mimicking me breathing when I inhaled, exhaling when I did the same. It felt obscene, like it was copying some deep part of me that shouldn't be copied. Then others started to mirror different aspects of me. One mirrored the tremor in my hands. Another tilted its head, following the exact angle of my fearful gaze. A third began walking, with my exact stride, mimicking my every move. It was as though they were reflecting me, copying my actions and responses with perfect mechanical precision. And that's when the full realization hit me almost like a punch to the gut. They weren't just watching me, they were studying me. They were preparing to replace me completely. My vision blurred my mind, racing with terror, the edges of my sight narrowing until all that remained were the closest figures. Their featureless faces seemed to pulse with dark intelligence, and I understood with sudden clarity that I was witnessing something that shouldn't exist, something that broke all the rules of reality. But then, impossibly, the sun moved. It shifted just a fraction, and with that, for the first time since I'd entered this place, shadows started to return. The watchers recoiled as one their forms flickering like static on a malfunctioning TV. For a brief moment, they appeared less solid, more translucent, like the appearance of shadows had disrupted whatever force was keeping them here. Time, too, seemed to snap back into motion. My watch flickered, the numbers rapidly speeding forward, as if it was trying to catch up with all the minutes that had been lost. The forest around me seemed to come alive again. Bird calls filled the air, Insects began humming once more, and the breeze returned. The watchers, however, were fading. Their pale forms were growing more translucent with each passing second, but they didn't disappear completely. They simply blended back into the natural light and shadow of the trees like they had never been there at all. I understood with a sickening certainty that they were still there, still watching, waiting. For the next time when time would freeze, when the sun would stop its journey, and they could return to their vigil, and that's when I ran. I crashed through the underbrush, which now bent and yielded as it should, following a trail that had reappeared as if by magic. Behind me, I could feel their attention, their eternal watch. I didn't stop running until I reached my car at the trailhead, hours later, miles away. But even now, weeks later, I find myself checking my watch obsessively, watching for the moment when the digital display might freeze again, because I know they're still out there. In that place where time stands still and shadows refuse to fall, they're waiting for me to return. Sometimes in the corner of my eye, I catch glimpses of pale figures standing just beyond the edge of my vision, watching, waiting, for their moment to step back into a world where the sun refuses to move, and the watchers can finally stop their eternal vigil. The trail may not be on any map, but I know exactly where to find it. And God help me, part of me wants to go back. Now let's move to the next story. I'll keep it in the same conversational style. The silence in my apartment had become unbearable. 3 months since Rebecca left. 3 months of nothing but the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant rumble of traffic bleeding through paper-thin walls. That's what drove me to Thornfield Antiques that grey October afternoon. The desperate need to fill the void, to drown out the echoes of my own breathing. The shop sat between a defunct pharmacy and a check-cashing place. Its windows were so grimy they looked like cataracts. Inside, dust particles danced in the shafts of weak sunlight, and the air tasted like mothballs and forgotten years. I wandered through the maze of furniture, my footsteps muffled by a carpet that had seen better decades. That's when I found it. The music box sat on a corner shelf, almost hidden behind a collection of chipped ceramic figurines. Its wood was dark mahogany, polished to a deep shine that seemed to absorb the surrounding light, rather than reflect it. Intricate carvings covered every surface, spirals and symbols that hurt to look at directly, as if they shifted when I wasn't paying attention. The metal hardware was tarnished silver with tiny rubies embedded around the base like drops of dried blood. My hand moved toward it without thinking. The moment my fingers touched the smooth wood, a shiver ran up my arm, and my chest tightened. The shop owner, a skeletal man with yellowed teeth, appeared beside me as if he'd materialized from the shadows. "Ah, you found the Orpheus box?" he said, his voice like rustling leaves. He told me it had belonged to a musician who died in the 1920s, though he couldn't remember the details. The price was surprisingly reasonable. Too reasonable, I'd realized later. I carried the box home in a paper bag, feeling its weight shift unnaturally with each step. Back in my apartment, I placed it on the coffee table and stared at it for a long time before finally lifting the lid. The melody that poured out was unlike anything I'd ever heard. It started as a simple waltz, but the notes seemed to twist, creating harmonies that shouldn't have been possible from a simple music box mechanism. The sound was hypnotic, drawing me deeper into its labyrinth of melodies. I sat transfixed, watching the tiny silver dancer spin on her pedestal, her painted smile never wavering. When I finally closed the lid, my neck was stiff and my mouth felt dry. hours had passed. The digital clock on my cable box read 11:47 p.m., though I could have sworn it was still afternoon when I'd opened it. But the music didn't stop. Even with the lid firmly shut, I could still hear it. Fainter now, like an echo of an echo, but definitely there. The melody wove itself through the ambient noise of the building, hiding beneath the rattle of pipes and the distant hum of the highway. I pressed my ear to the box, but the sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The chamber stretched out beyond the reach of my headlamp, its walls glistening with moisture that refracted the light into dancing shadows. The sound of water dripping somewhere in the distance echoed through the cave, each drop stretching out far longer than physics should have allowed. It wasn't just the silence that felt wrong, it was everything about this place. I should have turned back the moment I noticed my breathing was off. My air felt thick heavy, like it wasn't properly circulating. I'd been mapping underground formations for 8 years, and Black Rock should have been just another job, another report to file. But now, standing there 40 feet below the surface with tons of rock above me, something deep inside my gut told me that this time was different. My hands were shaking as I adjusted my equipment belt, trying to shake off the feeling of dread crawling up my spine. The darkness around me seemed to press in, suffocating, almost alive. I switched on my flashlight again, its beam cutting through the blackness, but I could still feel the dark stretching out just beyond my reach. It was supposed to be a routine geological survey, collect samples, measure depths, document any unusual formations. Standard procedure. Nothing I hadn't done a dozen times before. But the deeper I went, the more the cave seemed to change, as if it were responding to my presence. The walls, slick with moisture, seemed to whisper in the shadows, the echoes of water, taking on strange, distorted shapes in my mind. The unease had started to creep in when I first entered the chamber. I hadn't noticed it at first, just a slight tremor in the air, something that made my skin feel tight, and the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The deeper I ventured, the more oppressive the silence became. No animals, no insects, just the slow drip of water, the occasional creak of rock shifting under its own weight. I was supposed to be mapping the formations, but instead I found myself staring into the dark, waiting for something to move, waiting for something to make noise. But there was nothing. Nothing except that sickening silence and the sensation that I wasn't alone. I continued down the narrow path, deeper into the cave, my flashlight beam casting long shadows that seemed to flicker and move at the edges of my vision. My breathing felt shallow, even though I wasn't exerting myself. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, waiting for me to make the wrong move. Then I saw it, a small passageway, barely wide enough for me to squeeze through. It hadn't been marked on the map, and the walls around it looked smooth as though they had been carved out. The hairs on my neck stood up again, and I felt that familiar pressure in my chest, the kind that comes with the certainty that you shouldn't go any further. But I didn't listen to that voice. I stepped forward, the flashlight beam illuminating the dark space ahead, revealing nothing but tight, jagged rock walls. My footsteps echoed in the narrow passage, louder than I would have liked. The cave seemed to swallow the sound, almost as if it was absorbing it, pulling it into its depths. It wasn't long before I found myself in another chamber, smaller, but no less oppressive. The air was thick here, almost stagnant, and I could taste the earth in my mouth. The walls were covered in strange, fossilized markings that seemed to pulse with an odd rhythm, as if the cave itself was alive and breathing. I couldn't focus on the formations. I couldn't focus on anything but the growing sense of being watched. Then, the scratching started. At first, I thought it was just the sound of my equipment shifting the scrape of my boots against the rough stone, but it became clear something was moving down here, something other than me. The scratching grew louder, closer, and with it, a deep, guttural growl that vibrated the air around me. My heart began to pound in my chest, and I knew in that moment that I wasn't alone. Something was down here with me moving in the dark, just out of reach of my light. I turned ready to flee, but the path I'd come through had changed. The tunnel that had led me here was gone, swallowed by the rock. I spun around in panic, my flashlight beam dancing across the chamber, illuminating jagged stone formations and strange, pulsating markings on the walls. The growling was getting louder, closer, and the scratching, it was right behind me now. I didn't think. I ran. My feet pounded against the stone, my headlamp bobbing wildly as I sprinted through the cave, desperately searching for any sign of an exit. The growling followed me, echoing off the walls, growing louder with each step. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the growling stopped. The silence returned, but it wasn't the same silence I'd felt before. It was a suffocating quiet, thick with the weight of something watching me. I didn't dare look back, didn't dare slow down. I ran, my body screaming for air as the dark cavern seemed to stretch on endlessly. Eventually, I found my way back to the entrance, stumbling into the daylight as the sunlight hit my face like a slap. I collapsed onto the ground, gasping for breath, my heart hammering in my chest. I never spoke about what happened that day. I couldn't. It was too much, too insane, too terrifying to explain. But sometimes, late at night, when the wind is still, I hear scratching at the walls, and I know with a certainty that makes my blood run cold that the things in Black Rock Cavern are still waiting, still watching, still hungry for whatever foolish enough to come too close. The back roads of Pennsylvania had always been my refuge. The deeper I went into the countryside, the more I could feel the tight grip of the city loosening. The road twisted and turned between barren trees and forgotten farmhouses, the fall colors bleeding into the horizon. But that day, something was different. I had been driving for hours when I noticed it, an alleyway so narrow between two decaying buildings that I nearly missed it. Something about it drew me in, a feeling deep in my bones, as if I were being guided by some unseen force. I parked my car and walked towards the gap, the air cold and crisp against my skin. The alley stretched far beyond, where I expected, the shadows deepening, almost swallowing light itself. Halfway down, tucked in a corner, stood an old shop antiquities. The windows were caked in dust. The door aged and weathered as though it hadn't been opened in decades. Yet when I pushed it, the door swung open effortlessly with a soft chime that made my heart skip. Inside was a world of forgotten things, old furniture draped in sheets, books yellowing with time and objects whose uses had been lost to the ages. Behind a dusty counter, a figure stood. The old man was more than ancient. His skin was paper-thin and stretched tight over bone. But his eyes, those pale blue eyes, held something far older, something that spoke without words. He looked at me for what felt like an eternity before he finally spoke. His voice dry, like the rustle of dead leaves. "I've been waiting for you," he said, as if he had known I would come. "This is yours." He produced a pocket watch from beneath the counter. Its brass surface was tarnished green with age, and its chain blackened with time. The watch looked like it had been dredged from the bottom of a forgotten pond, but there was something about it, something magnetic that pulled at me. I reached out, without thinking, my fingers closing around the cold metal. The old man smiled, but his eyes never warmed. He told me that the watch was mine, by right not purchase. I didn't question him. My hand trembled as I held it, a shock of recognition flooding through me. It felt as though this watch had always been mine, like a connection was awakening deep inside me. I paid no money. It was as if the transaction itself was a ritual, something ancient and undeniable. With the watch heavy in my pocket, I walked back to my car, my legs unsteady, as though I were moving through a dream. By the time I reached home, I was drenched in sweat. Despite the cool evening air, I placed the watch on my kitchen table, staring at it under the harsh fluorescent light. Its cracked face seemed to mock me, the hands, frozen at an impossible angle, pointing to places that didn't exist on any map. With a trembling hand, I pressed the crown. The lid clicked open, and in that instant, the world stopped. The hum of my refrigerator, the ticking of my wall clock, they all froze. The room stood still, every speck of dust suspended in the air as if time itself had been stopped. Then from the shadows, they came. Shadows that detached from the corners and moved toward me, flowing like liquid ink. They had substance, and they moved independently of light, reaching up, curling around my legs, their whispers filling my mind. Panic surged through me, but my body was paralyzed. The shadows grew bolder, darker. A tendril reached my foot, cold as ice seeping into my skin. I knew then that these things meant me harm. They were trying to take something precious, and I understood with horrifying clarity that I was the one who had invited them. With every ounce of will I had, I forced myself to move inch by inch until I snapped the watch shut. The world lurched back into motion, and the shadows evaporated, retreating into the corners, leaving me gasping on the floor, trembling. For the next 3 days, I didn't touch the watch. It sat on the kitchen table, calling to me in ways I couldn't explain. Its pull was irresistible, a constant hum deep in my bones, urging me to open it again. Curiosity gnawed at me, and after days of research into time anomalies and hallucinations, nothing could explain what I had experienced. But still, the watch called to me, and I began to open it again, just for a moment, to see if the shadows would return. Each time they did, they came faster, more predatory. They learned, adapted, and I could feel myself growing weaker with each encounter. The temptation to open the watch became unbearable. The shadows followed me, even when it was closed in the corners of my vision, lurking in the darkness. It wasn't long before I discovered something else. As I examined the watch under a magnifying glass, I saw it engraved into its tarnished surface, barely visible beneath the layers of time, my initials carved in a style that didn't belong to my lifetime. The realization hit me like a jolt of electricity. This watch hadn't been waiting for me in that shop. It had always been mine. It had been passed down through generations, each holder carrying a piece of an unbroken legacy. And the shadows. They were the price. They weren't here to harm me. They were here to collect what was owed. The debt had been passed from father to son, from grandfather to grandson. It was an inheritance of time, and I had become its unwilling heir. I tried to destroy the watch, but nothing worked. I couldn't escape it, so I did the only thing I could. I returned to the alley. The shop was exactly as I had left it, dust-covered windows, musty air. But this time, the old man wasn't there. Instead, a woman stood behind the counter, her tired eyes meeting mine. "I've been waiting for you," she said, her voice as dry as the old man's, though her smile was knowing. The cycle continues. I left the watch on the counter and walked away, feeling lighter with every step. But as I reached my car, I heard her voice call out behind me, her words catching in the wind. "It will find its way back to you. It always does." That was 3 months ago. I've moved twice since then, changed my phone number, tried to lose myself in the blur of modern life. But sometimes, late at night, when the world is quiet, I hear the whisper of moving shadows. I know the watch is still out there, waiting. It will find me again. Time always collects its debts.